So let's go about taking a look at some examples of homeostatic responses, and that will lead us into an assignment for you to work on. So remember, it's all going to start with a stress. And so this stress is going to cause two distinct types of pathways to go about being initiated. So let's take a look at the intracellular signaling pathway. So we start with the stress. The stress is going to be triggered by a receptor within the cell, which is going to trigger an integrated response. This integrated response is hopefully going to be specific to the stressor so that it will slow down the rate at which we get the integration and the overall response. Hopefully we get enough response to eliminate the stressor altogether. The responses that we see here are going to be a change, the delta signal, a change in chemical secretions, a change in cytoskeletal structures, or a change in membrane dynamics. Now, whenever we look at these pathways, there's two distinct types of arrows that we're looking at that you'll see. One is the directional arrow. That means that we're leading to something. And the other is the blunted arrow. That's the arrow with the flat face. That means that we are attempting to inhibit. We utilize these schematics to minimize the amount of writing that we have to use. So if you think about it, we just talked for about 90 seconds. If we were to write all of this out, we're looking at paragraphs of responses. Instead of writing paragraphs, we are simply going to go about diagramming out what the responses happen to be. So here is what happens on the intracellular part. Now let's take a look at what happens when we have a synaptic response, a nervous response. And so once again, we start with what? We're going to start with a stressor. The stressor leads to an afferent neuron being stimulated, which leads to an interneuron being stimulated, which leads to the efferent neuron being stimulated, which causes an effect to take place. The effect is going to be a response to the stressor itself. The response to the stressor is going to inhibit the receptor being activated. It's going to inhibit the interneuron being activated. It's going to inhibit the pathway triggering the efferent neuron being activated in an attempt to make sure that we get the optimal response to eliminate the stressor. The responses that we see here is going to be through glandular secretions or through some sort of muscle action triggering the response. So if you think about like a tendon tap reflex, this is what we're looking at. If you're looking at, say, producing saliva when you are masticating, when you're chewing, this is the response pathway that we're looking at. And so this is part of the overall response network that's taking place. But it's not the only pathway we have to deal with when we're dealing with stressors, because when we look at the stressors, we have to pull into this the nervous system in terms of its overall response to the stress. Here we're going to talk about what happens when we have response or activation due to what's referred to as the alarm response. In this case here, we're looking at the autonomic nervous system coming into play in an attempt to remove the stress. If we have the stress present, remember we're dealing with a positive feedback loop, which means that we're going to be constantly stimulating more response in order to alleviate the stress altogether. And so we start with the stressor. The stressor is going to lead to responsiveness within the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which is going to trigger the autonomic nervous system response, which is going to trigger release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which triggers the alarm phase. All of this is cortically regulated, and we'll get more into this cortical regulation as we talk about neuroendocrine functioning and the quote-unquote hey dummy issue as it relates to stress. The alarm response that we see here is going to lead to an increased rate of depolarization. That is, tissues are going to be more apt to respond. We'll see an increase of blood pressure, an increase of heart rate, an increase of respiration rate, an increase of skeletal muscle contraction force, contraction strength. We'll see an increase of central nervous system, norepinephrine, and dopaminergic pathways. All of these pathways lead to an increased reactivity and a change of reflexivity. we are more apt to respond at this point in time. Not only are we going to respond, but we're going to respond in such a way that we're actually going to be greater than the response that is necessary in order to remove the stress. At the same time, the limbic system undergoes a differential responsiveness due to hypothalamic outflow. This change of limbic system function decreases hippocampal activity and increases the amygdala activity. This leads to additional alarming. It leads to an increase of what was usually referred to as a fear responsing. This increase of fear responsing increases attentiveness, that is, I am aware of everything that is happening around me, but it reduces my ability to focus on any individual stimulus. I don't know what the appropriate response is going to be here. All I want to do is respond to get rid of the stress. This leads to a change of recall and recollection. That is, I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing as I'm supposed to be doing it, which leads to even more reactivity, which leads to even more reflexivity. We see this over-responsiveness. We see this positive feedback loop of responsiveness occurring during periods of excessive stress where we cannot differentiate whether it's a stress or not. Opposite of this, we pull in the parasympathetic. We pull this in as we start to remove the stress, or when we start to perceive the stress as not being stressful. In this case here, we are blocking the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We're slowing down the rate of release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. We reduce the rate of depolarization peripherally. We reduce blood pressure, we reduce heart rate, we reduce respiration rate, we reduce the contractile force within the skeletal muscle, we reduce tonality taking place. We increase activation centrally to the GABA and to the serotonergic pathways, and we inhibit the glutamate, dopamine, and noradrenergic pathways centrally. The combination of the increased serotonin and reduction of glutamate and noradrenergic pathways centrally with the hypothalamic outflow on the limbic system diminishes amygdala function, increases hippocampal function. I become more attentive to what I need to attend to. It increases my level of focus and increases my level of recall and recollection. Because I'm not fearful at this point in time, combined with the reduction of the alarm phase, I get a reduced reactivity peripherally. I get a reduced reflexivity peripherally. I get the correct amount of tone within the muscle, which means that I'm able to move appropriately and effectively. When you can cognitively reduce the level of an external stimulus stress, you're able to appropriately respond to that stress, independent of the level of stress that is being placed on it. The way in which we're able to do this is governed by a physiological principle. The physiological principle that governs the responsiveness to stress is what's referred to as the specific adaptations to imposed demands. Specific adaptations to imposed demands, or the SAID principle, ensures that we have adaptation within the tissues and through the body that allows us to have the ability to return to homeostasis based off of specific responses to those stresses. It increases survivability, and it leads to that same stressor becoming less stressful with each exposure to the stress. Every physiological response that we study is governed by this principle. Every biological response that we see is governed by this principle. Part of this principle is going to allow for tissues to become resistant to stresses. Part of this principle is going to ensure that we have changes of performance based off of repetitive exposure to a given stress. The way in which this pathway occurs begins with some sort of homeostatic disruption or the perception of a homeostatic disruption, which stimulates the production of an endocrine response. This production of endocrine response leads to signaling that goes to the tissues. The signaling that goes to the tissues leads to an interaction via receptor binding, which leads to a change at which genetic expression takes place. The change in genetic expression leads to a change of RNA, which leads to a change of proteins, and the change of proteins lead to the change of cell function. This whole part is how cells respond to the stress. The response at the cell and the response within the tissue is going to lead to a tissue-specific adaptation to that stress or to that perceived stress. Hopefully we get enough response to return us back to homeostasis or eliminate the perception of the stress. Long term, this leads to tissue adaptations when the stress is repetitive. The pathway of activation is going to be the indication based off of the initial response leading to the production, release, and response from hormones and the possible functional adaptations at the tissues. So let's take a look at an example of this said principle. And let's take a look at an example of sweating during a run. And so we start our run. As we start our run, we start increasing muscle activity. The increase of muscle activity begins the initiation of heat buildup within the tissues. Heat buildup within the tissues, along with signals coming from muscle activity, leads to changes of response. Thermoregulators and the hypothalamus are going to send out signals that tell blood vessels dilate. They dilate so as to radiate away heat and evaporatively cool the body in an attempt to eliminate the initial heat signal. The problem is that we keep going. We keep going, and all of a sudden we get a signal that says too hot. That too hot triggers a signal that says slow down. We're working too much. The working too much leads us to slow down. Slow down alleviates the level of muscle activity so that we do not have excessive amounts of heat occurring within that activity. Which leads to a question. What happens the next time we go for a run? The next time we go for a run, what ends up happening is that we have adapted to the stimulus of the run. And so we're able to modulate the amount of muscle activity so that we do not experience the getting hot or getting too hot signals too early within the run. What I'd like you to do right now is think about a stress that you've experienced and about what responses you have occurred or what responses have occurred so that you're able to remain balanced. That is to get back to homeostasis. Instead of writing out paragraphs as a journal response, try to diagram out a feedback loop that indicates the disruption that you had and how you went about attempting to get back to being balanced. Once you're done with that, remember, We can think about these responses like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where I am constantly trying to be baby bear in this. I don't want to be too hard. I don't want to be too soft. I want to be just right. I don't want to be too hot. I don't want to be too cold. I want to be just right within the initial response. And we can think about the long-term adaptations like the Three Little Pigs, where I'm going to start with my straw hut, and then I'm going to move to my stick hut, and then I'll eventually be able to build my brick house. Take your homeostatic response that you just diagrammed out and attempt to turn that into one form or the other of these stories. We will take a look at these during our online time together, but please have them ready to go to share.